And this is according to US policymakers themselves. Now let's go over the actual specific evidence regarding the Trump administration itself. Now I know I have done this already, but I need to continue to do this because far too many people continue to ignore this. So I want to go over US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth at the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, February 12, 2025, in Brussels, and he is going to break down the entire plan. And the plan is not to make peace with Russia. It is to freeze the conflict so the US can pivot to China, deal with China, and then pivot back to Russia at a later date. That is the plan. And he laid it out step by step. He told Europe exactly what to do. Let's listen.
A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine. To further enable effective diplomacy and drive down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine, President Trump is unleashing American energy production and encouraging other nations to do the same. Lower energy prices, coupled with more effective enforcement of energy sanctions, will help bring Russia to the table. Safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Members of this contact group must meet the moment. This means donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defense industrial base, and importantly, leveling with your citizens about the threat facing Europe. Part of this is speaking frankly with your people about how this threat can only be met by spending more on defense. 2% is not enough. President Trump has called for 5%, and I agree. We're also here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese, with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively. These are first steps. More must still be done. We ask each of your countries to step up on fulfilling the commitments that you have made. And we challenge your countries and your citizens to double down and recommit yourselves not only to Ukraine's immediate security needs, but to Europe's long-term defense and deterrence goals.
And then from that day forward, Europe fully complied to every single point laid out by US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. Secretary Hegseth told Europe to donate more ammunition and equipment to Ukraine. He told them to begin expanding their defense industrial base. And this is exactly what the nations in Europe began doing. Germany set to spend big on army and infrastructure. We're talking hundreds of billions of euros to do this. You had Ursula von der Leyen, EU chief, unveils 800 billion euro plan to rearm Europe. She says, we are ready to step up.
We ask each of your countries to step up on fulfilling the commitments that you have made.
That is literally the phrase Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth used while giving his directives on February 12th in Brussels. We have Emmanuel Macron, President of France. Macron turns the screws on ministers to boost defense spending. Okay, and this was all in the aftermath of Secretary Hegseth's directive. And of course, the most damning of all was this. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth greets the United Kingdom's Secretary of State for Defense, John Healey, and takes questions from the president. This is when the UK Secretary of State for Defense, John Healey, said this. right across the table from U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth.
We last met last month in NATO, and then you challenged Europe to step up. You challenged us to step up on Ukraine, on defence spending, on European security, and I say to you that we have, we are, and we will further. And last week, the British Prime Minister announced the biggest increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War, and we will go further.
Secretary Hegseth told them to do it, and he is publicly acknowledging that they obeyed him. They heard the directive, and they answered it. And now we have the UK and France preparing exactly what U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth laid out in his February 12th directive.
Any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. They should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5.
They need to be part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5 because this absolves the U.S. from having to get involved directly. They used Ukraine down to the last Ukrainian. They're running out of Ukrainians. They're now getting the Europeans ready to be fed into the proxy war next. The whole point of a proxy war is to have others fighting it for you, to absorb all of the negative consequences of it while you yourself enjoy all of the benefits of it. And as Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth laid out on February 12th, the U.S. needs to pivot to China. They cannot be tied up in Ukraine. This is something Europe needs to do. And I hear a lot of people making the counter argument, Europe doesn't have the troops, they don't have the military equipment, they don't have the ability to fight and defeat Russia. That's not the point. Ukraine didn't have the manpower or the equipment to ever defeat Russia. It wasn't about defeating Russia, it was about overextending Russia. And that is all they need Europe to do. They need Europe to overextend Russia one way or the other by creating a national security threat. Russia needs to keep tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of troops tied up in and around Ukraine, dealing with or actually fighting a hot war with NATO nations. So this is British Prime Minister Keir Starmer talking about sending these troops into Ukraine, just as Secretary Hegseth told him to.
Sooner or later, Putin will have to come to the table. So this is the moment. Let the guns fall silent. Let the barbaric attacks on Ukraine once and for all stop and agree to a ceasefire now. That is why now is the time to engage in discussion on a mechanism to manage and monitor a full ceasefire and agree to serious negotiations towards not just a pause, but a lasting peace, backed by strong security arrangements through our coalition of the willing. And we won't sit back and wait for Putin to act. Instead, we will keep pushing forward. So the group I convened today is more important than ever. It brings together partners from across Europe, as well as Canada, Australia and New Zealand, with backing from others too, including Japan. We agreed we will keep increasing the pressure on Russia, keep the military aid flowing to Ukraine, and keep tightening restrictions on Russia's economy to weaken Putin's war machine and bring him to the table. And we agreed to accelerate our practical work to support a potential deal. So we will now move into an operational phase. Our militaries will meet on Thursday this week here in the United Kingdom to put strong and robust plans in place to swing in behind a peace deal and guarantee Ukraine's future security.
And just to be clear, what Prime Minister Keir Starmer is talking about is sending troops into Ukraine to provide those security guarantees. And we know that because of articles like this from Reuters. UK says a significant number of nations ready to provide troops for Ukraine peace. That is what he was talking about in his speech. Then there's articles like this. Macron says Russia's permission not needed to deploy troops in Ukraine. And in this article, it specifically talks about a few thousand troops from each state deployed at key points in Ukraine to conduct training programs and show our long-term support. Macron said in an interview that proposed contingents from countries that were members of the NATO alliance. They would serve as a guarantee of security, almost the exact wording of Secretary Hegseth.
Any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops.
And it also says for Ukraine, and that several European nations and also non-European nations, again, almost the exact wording used by Secretary Hegseth, have expressed their willingness to join such an effort when it is confirmed. Under no circumstances can the Ukrainians make territorial concessions without having any security guarantees. So again, what Secretary Hegseth laid out was a Minsk III framework to freeze the conflict and then create a Syria-style buffer zone inside Ukraine using European and non-European troops, not American troops, because it's a proxy war. They don't want to get involved directly. They need to pivot to China. And people keep forgetting that when the US says they want a ceasefire in Ukraine so they can pivot to China, it's not because the US seeks peace and stability around the globe. It is because they realize, and Secretary Hegseth said this himself,
the U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity.
They're recognizing the reality of scarcity. They cannot be in two places at one time. And they are trying to establish a division of labor between themselves confronting China in Asia in the exact same type of conflict they have provoked with Russia in Europe. And they want Europe to at least freeze the conflict, this confrontation with Russia, until the US has the ability to circle back and finish the job. While the US poses as wanting to end hostilities to achieve some sort of lasting peace, it is clear it's doing anything but that. Has an established history opposing as wanting peace while simply stalling for time to restart hostilities on terms tilted better in their favor. And that is exactly what the Trump administration is doing right now. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth laid it out openly in Brussels, a directive he gave to Europe that Europe is now implementing fully.